But authorities have warned of the risks of floods and landslides as heavy rain continues. Ports on the Pacific West Coast have reopened after escaping major damage. It was initially one of the strongest storms ever recorded, with wind speeds of more than 300 kilometers an hour. But it was soon downgraded after hitting land. James Cook reports now from the village of Emiliano Zapata.
This was the moment the strongest storm ever recorded in the Americas raced ashore. It hit southwest Mexico with winds of 165 miles per hour. But by the time the hurricane they call Patricia arrived here, they were ready. With daylight, it was clear that water had caused as much damage as wind. There was flooding on the coast and here further inland. For those who felt the full force, it was tough.
We didn't leave. The water damaged the mattresses, the refrigerator, everything.
The authorities were saying that it was going to be strong, but we were not expecting the flooding. All the farmers here are losing a lot of money.
The truth is that it destroyed a good portion of our home and took a lot of trees, but thankfully we're all okay. I'm here with my family and later we'll go and join our neighbours to offer help.
This was clearly a powerful hurricane. You can see that by the damage that the winds have caused here. But people knew it was coming. They were warned, and it seems they heeded those warnings. This could have been so much worse. In preparation, thousands of people have been moved from beach resorts, including many tourists. But there was also luck involved. The storm hit hardest in an area where relatively few people live, between two cities. And where aid is needed, it does seem to be getting through. Here, the Red Cross were on hand with food parcels.
We're talking about a very powerful hurricane that threatened to damage in a serious way, but fortunately the damages weren't so severe.
The raw power of nature may have met its match in the people of Mexico, who today are mending, not mourning. James Cook, BBC News, Emilio Zapata in Mexico.
The US Secretary of State John Kerry says Israel and Jordan have agreed measures aimed at reducing tensions surrounding the Temple Mount compound in Jerusalem, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located. Issues relating to the site have been at the center of recent violence between Israelis and Palestinians. Mr. Kerry was speaking in Jordan, which is the formal custodian of the religious complex.
Israel will continue to enforce its long-standing policy of religious worship at the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, including the fundamental fact that it is Muslims who pray on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, and non-Muslims who visit. Israel has no intention, 3, of dividing the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, and it rejects completely any attempt to suggest otherwise.
And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also been speaking about recent talks aimed at diffusing tensions.
Israel believes that those who visit or worship on the Temple Mount must be allowed to do so in peace, free from violence, from threats, from intimidation, and from provocation. We will continue to ensure access to the Temple Mount for peaceful worshippers and visitors while maintaining public order and security. We welcome increased coordination between the Israeli authorities and the Jordanian Waqf, including to ensure that visitors and worshippers demonstrate restraint and respect for the sanctity of the area.
Well, Sergei Lavrov has been maintaining a dialogue with the US Secretary of State John Kerry. And as we've been hearing, Mr. Kerry is on a tour of the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia being the latest stop on his itinerary. The BBC's chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, is in Riyadh with the latest on efforts to broker an international deal.
Well, this is really some new and very rare diplomatic momentum on the Syrian crisis. It's long been said that in order to make any progress at all in ending this devastating war, there has to be much greater engagement by Moscow and Washington. And this is what we're seeing now. And the latest developments are seeing Russia using some military means to advance its objectives in Syria. In now saying, it's a marked departure from Moscow, in saying that it will help the relatively moderate Free Syrian Army on the ground in Syria as long as it continues its fight against the so-called Islamic State. It is actually extending a hand to the United States. The FSA is America's only military ally on the ground in Syria, but Russia knows that the FSA is also one of the weakest military forces, and it may believe that by extending its hand on this front, it can win some concessions from the United States and from Arab states like Saudi Arabia to get opposition groups to sit around the table with President Assad. Russia is, after all, the main backer of President Assad. President Assad has tended to dismiss all opposition forces, all armed groups as terrorists, and Russia has tended to agree with it. But Russia has been playing a role in recent years in trying to get some opposition groups to Moscow, but there tended to be the opposition groups who were willing to accept a role for President Assad in a future political government. I think it now realizes that with the forces in Syria on the battlefield becoming more extreme, Islamic State as it's called, or Al-Qaeda-linked groups, it has to find an opposition force with some military legitimacy if it wants to have a genuine opposition to try to come to some agreement around a table. But we haven't seen any movement in the position of Arab states, including Saudi Arabia. John Kerry has been speaking to the Saudi king, King Salman. He will play an absolutely critical role in any movement on the Syria file. So far, Saudi Arabia and other Arab Gulf states are saying there is no role for President Assad. The most they have said is that President Assad can play a role in the negotiations toward a transitional government, but not the transitional government itself. While Washington and London and other Western capitals are starting to say, they're softening their opposition, saying, well, President Assad can stay for a short time in the transition. But that, so far, has not been accepted. So the role of President Assad remains the main stumbling block to any movement on the political front.
Least who said there. In other news this hour, the Brazilian president Dilma Rousseff has been touring parts of the south of the country hit by flooding. A state of emergency was declared on Friday after heavy rain left large areas of the Rio Grande do Sul state submerged. Hundreds of homes have been flooded and thousands of people evacuated. Torrential rain has caused severe flooding in the town of Tilde on the Spanish Canary Islands. Some cars were carried down to the sea by fast-flowing water in the worst weather seen in the area for over 20 years, according to local residents. The Canary Islands have seen heavy rains during the week, but conditions are predicted to improve. And police in Montenegro have fired tear gas to disperse thousands of demonstrators calling for the resignation of the Prime Minister, Milo Đukanović. Some of the protesters threw flares and fireworks at police guarding the parliament. Several policemen were injured. Mr. Đukanović has been in power for much of the past 2 decades. A parade in Oklahoma ended in tragedy after a car drove into the crowd, killing 4 people and injuring at least 35 others. 8 of them had to be airlifted to hospital. The driver was arrested on suspicion of driving under the influence of alcohol. Ben Bland reports.
This is where crowds had gathered for a day of fun and celebration, but Stillwater, Oklahoma is now a city in shock and grief. During the State University's annual homecoming parade, a car mounted the pavement and drove into the crowd.
We are heartbroken at this tragedy, and our thoughts and prayers are with the families of those who died and of those who are injured.
Police arrested the driver and released this picture. They've named her as Adacia Avery Chambers, 25 years old and who lives in Stillwater. She was arrested on suspicion of driving under the influence of alcohol.
The Oklahoma State Homecoming Parade is probably one of the most wholesome, happy events in the country. And to have it fouled like this and these victims, it's terrible tragedy.
The football game scheduled as part of the event went ahead as planned, but players and fans held a moment of silence before kick-off in tribute to those who'd been killed and injured. Meanwhile, nearby, the investigation continued.
The police department's accident reconstruction team is on scene. We treat these like we would any homicide investigation. It will probably take several days to get additional information as to the cause of the accident.
Several days that will be an anxious wait for information for the families and friends of the victims. Ben Bland, BBC News.
Roman Catholic bishops, after a 3-week synod at the Vatican, have reached a compromise on divisive family issues, including whether to allow divorced members of the Church to take communion. But as Caroline Wyatt now reports from Rome, the final report called for a case-by-case approach, but restated the Church's position that there was no foundation for same-sex marriage.
After a sometimes tense and occasionally fractious 3-week meeting, bishops from across the world voted on 94 articles on how the Roman Catholic Church treats the family. The least contentious were voted through with ease, but 3 dealing with the possibility of offering communion to Catholics who've divorced and remarried without seeking an annulment only just squeaked through. In his own summary, Pope Francis explained what he'd hoped for from this gathering. He said it was about listening to the voices of the family and showing the vitality of a church unafraid to soil its hands with frank discussion. In what's being seen as a criticism of the most conservative bishops, the Pope said it was also about laying bare the closed hearts that hid behind the Church's teachings to judge what he called wounded families.
Times are changing, and we Christians must change continuously. We must change whilst remaining fixed to our faith in Jesus Christ, fixed to the truth of the gospel. But we must adapt our attitude continuously according to the signs of the times.
Most conservative are relieved that the final synod document restated church teaching that gay Catholics shouldn't suffer discrimination, but that there was no foundation whatsoever for same-sex marriage. And in a result that will please the most liberal, the synod agreed to emphasise the role of individual conscience in dealing with difficult family situations, which may ultimately allow those who remarry outside the church being granted access to the sacraments. All this is likely to form the basis of a later document by the Pope himself. However, many have been critical of the process, warning that the synod risked sowing confusion among the faithful and dividing the church in the future. Caroline Wyatt, BBC News, Rome.
Well, stay with us on BBC News because still to come. Up for auction, the blurry black and white photograph taken the day after the sinking of the Titanic, which could be worth thousands of dollars.
A historic moment that many of his victims have waited for decades. The former dictator in the dock, older, slimmer, and as he sat down, obedient enough.
Dawn, and as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Coram, it lights up a biblical famine, now in the 20th century.
The depressing conclusion. In Argentina today, it is actually cheaper to paper your walls with money.
We've had controversies in the past with Great Britain, but as good friends, we have always found a good and lasting solution.
Concorde bows out in style. After almost 3 decades in service, an aircraft that has enthralled its many admirers for so long taxis home one last time.
This is BBC News, I'm Gavin Gray, and these are the latest headlines. Mexican authorities have issued warnings about the risks of floods and landslides as heavy rain continues following Hurricane Patricia. And Russia authorities say they are ready to provide air cover for a Western-backed rebel group in Syria as long as it attacks Islamic State militants. The Vice President of the Maldives, Ahmed Adib, has been arrested in connection with a plot to assassinate the country's president, Abdullah Yameen. Mr. Yameen escaped serious injury after a bomb was detonated on a boat he was travelling on. 3 people, including his wife, were hurt. Joanna Jolly reports.
President Yameen's boat was targeted last month as he was returning home from a Hajj pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia. He escaped injury, but his wife was badly wounded in the explosion and remains in hospital. Investigators initially blamed the blast on a mechanical failure, but the government now says it was an assassination attempt on the president. Now this man, Vice President Ahmed Adib, has been arrested in connection with the attack. The 33-year-old former tourism minister only took up his post 3 months ago, after the previous vice president was sacked. Police have charged him with high treason.
I urge the public not to create any chaos or disruption in the country. Police will take action against any disorder. I urge the public to support the special operations carried out by the police in relation to the investigation.
In recent years, the Maldives has been rocked by political infighting. Many question the legitimacy of the current president after he came to power in disputed elections 2 years ago. Although Vice President Adib had been a strong supporter of the president, there were rumours he may have been planning his own bid for power.
Most of the opposition here is sort of silently watching what's going on, and we're now seeing a clear split within the ruling party, and with Adib's supporters and President Yamin's supporters sort of clashing on social media, but the streets of Mali remain quite calm.
Police say they've deployed extra officers on the street as a cautionary measure. If the crisis continues, there are fears it could hit the Maldives' economy, which relies heavily on tourism. Joanna Jolly, BBC News.
General elections are taking place on Sunday in Argentina, governed for the last 8 years by the leftist populist president Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. While all the candidates seeking to replace her agree